I like to share something that is a personal passion of mine. I don't know if any of you are familiar. There's a global breakdancing competition every year called Battle of the Year. Have any of you heard of this? No? It's fantastic. It's fantastic. It's been going on for 30 years. And what happens is that it's run like the Olympics. So every country sort of submits their own team, and then those teams all compete in a breakdancing battle, which then culminates in this thing. This is the final breakdancing battle. Now, as a spoiler, Korea basically always wins. Um, One of the reasons for that is that, as you might know, if you're in South Korea, you are conscripted. If you're a male, you're conscripted into military service. That's a fact of life. There's only two exceptions. If you're really good at StarCraft, and if you're really good at breakdancing. Those are two exemptions that get you out of conscripted military service. And the reason is that some senator's son was really good at both of those things. So this is a battle from 2005. You've got Japan over here on the right. You've got Korea over here on the left. And just watching people do things that are supposed to be physically impossible fills me with so much joy, as does the idea of settling differences via breakdancing. Like thinking about the world where what would happen if we actually solved our differences with breakdancing battles. I mean, I would lose every argument, but I'd be happy for like this mummy to win. Like, and look at how great that guy's hair is. I know, right? But what happens if they go Zerg? Oh no. A little short in pre-talk time. I'm just gonna skip forward because, yeah, you're just doing that. Yeah, sure, no problem. There we go.
Six minutes to go! I've got a date with the rain. Gotta go walking in the rain. The clouds are gathering in the skies, gathering in my eyes. Every time it rains, on just such a day, you let me go.
If you're interested, you can actually, like, a bunch of the stuff is on YouTube. Otherwise, there are DVDs that exist. The one thing I will say is that there's an American-made movie starring Chris Brown called Battle of the Year. Under no circumstances watch that movie. First of all, Chris Brown. Secondly, they were like, let's make a breakdancing movie, but let's make sure that we pay attention to the plot, because otherwise we'll have to show breakdancing, and who wants to watch that?
Oh yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah.
Pow!
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
All right, I'm gonna pause that for just a sec because there's one more thing I wanted to show you. Her name is B Girl Tara. At the time of filming this, she's like 7 years old. B Girl Tara is up against another child breakdancer, and that other child breakdancer is totally good, totally competent, totally fine, and totally mismatched. But this kid's good. But then here's Tara. Oh! My favorite part in a sec here. But then this kid comes out and she goes, no, I'm not done murdering you yet. You're not you're not done. We're still gonna murder you. I'll pause for a sec here, and I'm going to say that there is a interactive Q&A session here. If you go to slido.com, that's SLIDO.com, and then you do hashtag BuildStuff2019 as your code. You can do Q&A. I have a full presentation. It doesn't actually need Q&A, but if you have questions, I would love to answer your questions. This is the subject I'm very passionate about. As is that a subject I'm passionate about. So amazing. You know, one of the challenges with doing this sort of breakdancing as a pre-talk is that it's good. It makes me feel good. I think it's fun to share this passion that I have. But then I'm in the unfortunate position of having to follow this kind of breakdancing. And so if you're expecting this kind of lively dancing, I mean, I'm just going to say sorry in advance. And let's make sure that, hey, there we go. Turn that off. Oh, yeah. Hi. How's it going, everybody? Oh, come on. Software developers, you don't have to be like that. Come on, let's do this again. Let's do this again. How's it going, everybody? There. Oh, I love it. Okay, fantastic. In Lithuania, Vilnius, it's a fantastic city. I'm so excited to be here. I've only spent a little bit of time non-jet lagged in the city, and I've loved it so far. Also, I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota, which means that I am experiencing amazing weather. Oh, so good. I only have to wear one jacket. It's terrific. So my name is Lemon, and I make websites. I'm guessing by saying I make websites, that's something I probably have in common with a number of you, but that's something that I've been doing for well over a decade, close to 2 decades. I like making websites. I make websites for money. I also make websites for enjoyment. I have that kind of disease that when I get home from my work, I still want to make websites. If you go to ahoylemon.xyz, you see a whole bunch of dumb websites, including a game that you can play with Google autocomplete and programmatically, algorithmically created terrible sex advice. But I make websites and I like it, and when I do that thing, that stack can change all the time, depending on what I'm working on. So how many of you have heard of Pug? Have you ever heard of Pug? No? Okay. Yeah. Okay. I like Pug a lot. It is a preprocessor HTML language. It's just a way to write HTML faster. Um, so I end up using Pug where available because I do find it fun. I see, by the way, some seats around here for those of you in the back. If you're interested in seats, I think I see, well, probably about 8 or 9 mixed in here in the front. Otherwise, if you want to hand in the back, that's cool. Anyway, I like Pug. I use that a lot. I write in Sass a lot. There's a bunch of things that are in Sass that eventually CSS adopted, like variables and stuff like that, which is great, but I still think Sass is pretty powerful. I write in that a lot. I use Vue. That's something that specifically I just found the best for me personally. I experimented with React and with Angular, and when I found Vue, I was like, that's actually the way I think. I do write in Vue pretty frequently when I'm writing JavaScript, but sometimes I'm not. Sometimes I'm actually writing in Ember. Ember is really, really good too. There's a lot of really cool stuff in Ember, and that's also a really valid option. Now, again, I make websites for a living, and that means that sometimes those websites are sort of corporate monoliths, and so that means that I'm probably working in a Microsoft.NET environment. That's never necessarily my choice personally, but if the backend guys tell me, they say, we're going to do this thing in .NET, yeah, cool, no problem. Let's write some Razor. We can do this thing. But when I'm not doing that, sometimes I'm doing CMSs. CMSs for smaller companies, something that they're going to use, which means that I'm going to be writing in PHP. Basically, every CMS that I like is written in PHP. So I write a lot of PHP as well. Going back to that Sass thing, there's something called Bourbon, which you can use in Sass as a way to kind of like give you some useful kind of guidelines to help you out with that. So Bourbon is good. Also, I really like beer and gin. But all of those programming languages, except for the 2 fake ones that I invented at the end, all boil down to 3 basic concepts, and that is HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. No matter what, you're going to be writing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. No matter what stack you want to pretend that you're working in, it's going to come down to these 3 languages. Now, you can kind of avoid this one. You never really avoid this one, and you won't avoid this one. So you're going to be doing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript no matter what. That's going to happen. And I want to talk to you about just this one CSS, and that is because I really, really do like CSS. I really do a lot. It is my favorite language to write in. And the thing is that, here's the thing. I'm not going to come here to Lithuania and lie to you. I'm not going to come to your country, accept your welcome, and lie to you and say to you that CSS is easy. CSS is not easy. Anyone who says that, well, they have a tumor. But CSS, Dave Rupert of Shop Talk Show described CSS as, he said, CSS is really easy. All you need to do is memorize several tens of thousands of key value pairs in your set. That's what CSS is. And I'm not going to say that it's easy, but CSS is great. It really is. And when I think about that, when I think about this language, I think about this GIF. Yeah, that's right, that's right. I know a bunch of you have seen this GIF. I know a bunch of you have laughed at this GIF, and I understand the concept that puts this thing together. Talk is called I'm going to make you stop hating CSS. We're going to do a poll right here at the beginning. How many of you, raise your hand if you genuinely hate CSS? If you actually hate CSS? Okay. Keep them up just for a sec. I'm just trying to figure out who I'm going to play to here. All right, fantastic. Again, I understand that conundrum, and what I'm going to try to do in this talk is I'm going to try to turn this into this, because CSS is really interesting and does really, really cool things to your code. So our agenda here, what we're going to do is we're going to do 3 things. First of all, we're going to start off with things that are weird. In CSS, things are weird. There are totally weird things in CSS, and I need to be upfront with you and say that right off the bat. There's things that are weird. We're going to move on from things that are weird. We're going to go into things that are great, and then finally things that you can try. And hoping by the end of this, I can change. I remember you. I can remember you. Yeah, I'm going to change your mind. So let's get weird. This is Hocus Pocus by Focus. Okay, one of the first weird things in CSS is a concept called overflow. And the best way to explain the concept of overflow is to look at an image that I think you've also seen before, which is this. Okay. Yeah. Again, I know. So what I thought about doing is I wanted to take this image that we've all seen before, and I want to take this image and turn this into actual CSS. And that's actually not too hard to make this in CSS. So here's what I did. I just set a box, and then I set a border of 0.1 EM, and the EM is a relative unit of measurement to say that I'm speaking relatively to the font size. Then I set a width of 4 EM and a padding of 0.3 EM in order to create, oh, and then there's the HTML, and then I created that. That is pure CSS. This is HTML right here. So that is what I made. Now, as you can see, it's slightly different than what you see right up there. Slightly different. But the thing is that if you actually go to Redbubble or whatever, that you can buy the shirts. That image can change vary to vary. So this is what I went with. And let's try to figure out this box model in overflow and try to figure out what to do about this. So what we're going to start with is we're going to say, well, okay, I don't want this thing hanging out here. That's weird. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say overflow hidden. Simple concept, okay. And then if we do that, we get this. Well, that's less than ideal. That is not what we want. Like, I'm not sure exactly what I was making at this point, but that's definitely not the right answer. Okay, let's keep going. So if we go overflow Y hidden. Now, if we say overflow Y hidden, that expressly means, unless we define it otherwise, that overflow Y is hidden and overflow X is auto. So if we do that specific thing, then what we have is this. We got basically the same thing, except for this particular thing can scroll left to right. Now, that's not great user experience. That's not really what some. Okay, well, that's probably not what we want either. It seems a little bit better than our overflow hidden, but not great. Let's keep going. Word break word. Now, word break word. CSS is weird. I know this. The CSS working group knows this, and they have an actual, on the CSS working group, a list of apologies. Here's some things that we regret doing, and one of them is word break word. That's insane. But if you do word break word, which is something I always have to Google when I'm trying to write it, you end up with this. And that's better. That's better. So what we're defining here is that we're saying, hey, if some text is actually too long, just go ahead and chop it wherever you want to do it. That's better. But we're still not great. We still don't have like an actual square that we want to go for. So let's keep going. Text overflow ellipsis. Now this is something you'll see a lot of times in tables. Like if, for example, if you have a table and there's a value that's too big for that table cell, you do text overflow ellipsis to say like, I'm going to cut off some of this, and then if you hover over it, you can see the full value. And if we do that specific thing, okay, then we end up with that. CSS is on. We haven't solved our problem yet. We haven't solved our problem with the overflow model. We haven't figured out how to fix this box. So let's look at our CSS and let's figure out how we can fix this problem. So we've got our box with our border, our width, and our padding. Now here's the thing. We set an express width. We did that in the instruction. What was the rendering engine supposed to do? You defined text that was too big for its box. The browser tried to do something to make that thing work. And that's what it ended up with. If you go into that situation, literally, I cannot think of a thing that you would want the browser to do that would actually contain that box down. You could do like dynamic text size, but you didn't define that. You defined this particular thing. You created a design problem. This is not a CSS problem. This is a design problem. We take that thing out, then we just end up with this. CSS is awesome. And I think that it is. I got this idea from Brandon Smith. He did a blog post on CSS Tricks, which is a really great site. Their almanac is fantastic for just kind of like learning of why stuff exists. We've covered overflow. We're going to move into something that is also strange, and that is position. So when we're going to start off with position, I'm going to start off with a little bit of a quiz. And what I'm going to do here, so I've got these values. Which of these is the default position that's given to any div? Oh, that totally was a trick question. That absolutely was a trick question. The actual default position that you have without defining anything else is actually static. Static is position is comparable to relative, but it's different. We're going to dig into why. So we're going to go through our different positions and just sort of like how they work. So if we start off here with position absolute says, I want you to staple this box to its nearest restrictive element. That could be the DOM itself, or that could be a box that holds it in. If we do that, then we've got this specific idea, which is fine. That's basically what we want. Okay, cool. We're good. So then we're moving on, and then we've got position fixed. Position fixed is very different than absolute because fixed says, I don't want you to bind this to the DOM, I want you to bind this to the window. The window is the thing that matters. And so if we scroll through, we actually keep our fixed. If you say to yourself, well, I've got these users coming to my website, but I would like to punish them for coming to my website. And so I want to create one of those giant email sign-up forms that happens like 2 seconds after you log in. Position fixed is how you should do that. Also, do not do that. Position sticky is actually a newer concept in CSS, new-ish. It's got wide browser support, and it's actually pretty interesting. So what we have with sticky is actually the middle point between a position relative and a position fixed. So what happens is we've got our sticky element, and we've given it some rules, and then when we scroll, it's going to get itself to the top and stay here. Now, a lot of times, this specific idea is actually written in JavaScript. You no longer have to do that. You can define a sticky element to say, scroll normally until this rule happens, and then go ahead and stick this thing where I say to. It's a very cool thing. Moving on from sticky, we've got position relative, and it's a box, sure. And then we've got position static. Again, it's just a box. These are both just basically boxes the way that you expect boxes to exist. So if we look at all 5, we can see kind of like how those things work together. And then we're looking at our relative and our static elements and going, well, you're basically the same. So why? Oh, yeah, there's the text explanation of that thing. But why does position static exist? Because the difference between your relative and your static elements is that your relative elements is the thing that you probably want. Your static elements is the same thing, but less useful. When you go into the situation of, and I think that this has probably happened to you before, where you've gone, okay, well, I've got these couple of boxes, and I want this one to come on top of this one, but it's actually underneath this one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type z-index. And so you go z-index 9, and it goes, nope. And then you go, okay, z-index 99, nope, okay, z-index 999999999999999. When that happens to you, as it has happened to me many, many times, the problem is actually that you're not looking at a static element, you're not looking at a relative element, you're looking at a static element, and that's what created that thing. Also, static will not accept the values of top, bottom, left, right. You write them, it's just going to ignore them. And it's also not going to hold your absolute element. If you got a div with an absolute div inside of it, that absolute div is going to bump out of it. So then you go, well, why does position static exist? And it exists because it does. CSS is an additive language. It's not a changing language. So things can get added to the CSS spec as they do constantly. There's people that are devoted to changing that spec, except for changing means adding things. When something is defined as a rule, it continues to be a rule until the end of time. Can you do something about that? Well, you could. You could do this. And that's something that you absolutely could put in your code right now and say, hey, I want you to take every element, and unless I say otherwise, define that element as position relative. That could get you through some things, except for that could create problems, because you could run into a situation where you're taking somebody else's code, you're taking somebody else's a plugin or whatever, and you're working with that thing, and it's expecting a static element where it's actually running into a relative element, and now that absolute box is going to bump into a different place than it's supposed to be. So this is not necessarily what I'd recommend unless it's all your code. What I'd recommend instead is if you're running into a problem with a specific div, if you're running into something that's not doing the rules that you tell it to, start with this and just start to say, this particular element, let's go position relative a bunch of times. That's going to fix your problem. I wrote a CodePen article on this. If you just search CodePen, I've also got the slide decks that I'll be sharing soonish, but z-index is definitely weird. Okay, When I think about float, that's not what comes to my mind. That's not what float looks like to me. That's what float looks like to me. A bunch of the problems that are caused in CSS are caused because of float. Float is something that we had that was following the concept of table layouts, and when people were trying to do proper responsive design and trying to set up these grid columns without writing tables, they started to write stuff in floats, and there's insane stuff that exists in floats. I'm going to start off by showing you the one and kind of only one reason to use a float. This is the one layout you'd actually be using a float for. So this is Tina Belcher of Bob's Burgers. And what we have here is we have an article with an image, and we've got text. And the reason why float is really helpful here is that if you look down at this part right in here, we see that we've got a image, we've got a paragraph, and we've got another paragraph. And this paragraph wraps. That's what we want it to do in this particular case. This is what our layout should look like, and this is what float can work with. So it's creating an image and then floating everything over to the side of it. There's not really a grid system that would do that for you. So we've got float instead. But if we take that exact same markup and change just a little bit of it, we run into this problem. So this is something that floats will create all of the time. Again, we've got an article, we've got an image, we've got a paragraph tag. But that paragraph tag ends, and then this image comes over here and says, well, I'm done, so let's just go ahead and kill the article. And so you run into this situation. And so the reason why this exists is that the way that the float happens is that when a float is introduced to the DOM, it says, okay, I'm going to get in the DOM, and I'm going to just create a gap after me and say, you put whatever content after me that you want, and I'm just going to stay over here. You've kind of removed some of the DOM system. And so in doing that, this box no longer knows what to contain. So can you fix it? Yeah, you can fix it. You can fix it, and you can fix it the way that it has been fixed many, many, many times. This code is probably somewhere in your code base. Now, I don't know, what company you work for. I don't know what your code base looks like, but here's what I know is that this or something very much like this exists in your code, and this code exists as a way to clear a float. It is a hack. It is absolutely a hack, but this is the way that a lot of people clear floats. So if we do this specific thing, and we go back to our thing of Tina, we've got this. And what we did is we just added that little bit of CSS in the after element to do that. Why? Okay, so what happened here is that we again have our article, and then we've got our image, we've got a paragraph tag, and then we've said as an after element for our article, I want you to add a table that does not exist that clears floats. And that's what you've created. So right here is a fictional, like, Heisenberg principle table that exists in your mind, and that's the thing that clears floats. Well, so now that we've got this, now that we're set up with this, now that we know how to clear floats, well, why don't we just make a layout with floats? Why don't we do that? Twitter's done that. Facebook's done that. A lot of big companies have done that. So let's just go ahead and make a layout with floats. We know how to fix them. Here we go. So this is a traditional piece of content that you would expect anywhere on the internet, and that, of course, would be 6 pictures of William T. Riker with quotes from William T. Riker. That's what the internet looks like to me. I mean, I don't know what your web pages look like. Also, Worf, it's better than music. It's jazz. All right, so now that we've got what we want our content to look like, now that we've got a grid system that we want to make, we can do this in floats. So we'll take this and we'll go, all right, I'm going to define a Riker. And a Riker, I'm going to say, is floated left with a width of basically 33%. Except for we've got margins, and so we allow our CSS to create a calculated element. Now, this is something that's actually kind of surprising, is that you can go and you can define a measure and calculate it, and the computer will do a calculation. And like, most of the time, it'll get it right. Like, even IE will actually properly calculate an element. It's insane. A calculator and a computer? Who would have thought? So you can do this thing and you can say, okay, 33% minus our margins, and now we've basically got the concept of a Riker divided, and we're going to take that and we're going to turn that into a grid. And so here's our grid. Oh no, Oh no. Okay, well that's not. Oh, 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 it's getting worse. Okay, that sucks. Okay, that super sucks. That is bad. If you look into, for example, Twitter Bootstrap, or Bootstrap, I should call it, now Bootstrap uses a different code base, but when they did use floats, they had a whole bunch of weird hacky crap in order to make this thing not happen. All of those little container elements, have you ever written Bootstrap that you had to do with like, here's a container and here's a row? A lot of that stuff is doing that in order to clear these floats. And we could do this. We could do that and we could say, well, here's a vertical stripe and it's 3, and then I want you to clear these floats at this particular thing. And we could do that, but we don't have to. I'm going to give you hope now, because we've talked about things that are weird, and now I want to talk about things that are great. And one of those things is grid. Now, in sort of the CSS community, there's a whole bunch of hype about grid. There's a whole bunch of people that are talking about grid. There's a whole bunch of people that are enthusiastic about grid, and there's a bunch of great reasons for that. So I want to go back to our Riker example right here. And I'm going to define this Riker in CSS grid. So here's what I'm going to do. So step 1 is I'm going to say all Rikers is a grid element. And it's got template columns of repeat 3 1FR. We'll get back to that rule in just a sec. But what we're saying here is we want 3 columns, and I want a gap in between those things of 30 pixels. And then, having done that, step 2 is we're actually done. We're done. We've made our grid. This is literally the only code that you need in order to make that grid. We've finished it. In 288 bytes, we've actually finished the code of our Riker grid. And in fact, when I was trying to figure out a grid to make and something to demo to you, I actually just wrote this in grid first, and then I wrote it wrong in float afterwards. So one of the pieces of magic that's happening here is this grid template column. There's also a grid template rows to define rows as well as columns, but for the second, we're just going to talk about grid template columns. There's a bunch of ways to define this thing, and we're going to go through those. So if we've got our grid template columns, we can define this in a couple of ways. One is 1FR, 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 that is called 3 equal fractions. You can define that thing the exact same way, but with the shorthand, just a little bit easier to read. We can do mixed stuff, which is fun. And then we can also do sort of repeat elements. So the thing that the CSS grid spec introduced was the concept of 1FR or 2FR or 3FR. That's to say this is a fraction. And so what you're saying is that, hey, browser, you've got a bunch of space, and I want one portion of that space. And then I'm going to say, I'm going to do 2 portions of that space, 3 portions of that space. The 1FR doesn't define itself by percentages. It doesn't define itself by pixels. It just says, whatever you've got available, break me off a piece of that. So we're going to show some grid examples with a lot of these different grid concepts. And to do that, I want to introduce you to my gin and tonic. Now, I am not a professional mixologist because I think that's an annoying word. But I'm just somebody that likes gin and tonics. And so my gin and tonic is made this way. I do 4 ice cubes, I do 1 jigger of gin, I do tonic water, and I do a lime wheel. And in saying that that's my recipe, what I'm saying is that I know that I want exactly 1 jigger of gin. I know that I want the ice cubes, but like, figure it out from the rest of this. And so what that allows us to do is that we can fill up our glass, and no matter what kind of glass we have, because, you know, sometimes I've got specific glasses, but sometimes I don't. No matter what, I know exactly how much gin I've got going on in that thing because the other things are defined in your FR. That example is actually making me a little thirsty. So let's look at this. So we've got our grid template columns, and we're going to say 1FR, 1FR. And so that's going to say, hey, I want 2 equal measurements of FR. And then that gives us this, okay? So this is not something in a lot of other situations. You would define this in a bunch of different ways. But in this particular case, we're just saying, I got a grid with 2 columns in it. Neat. I mean, cool. Yeah, I guess. But like, there's other ways to do that. That's not super exciting. Okay. Now if we go repeat for 1FR, again, this is a shorthand element to just say, repeat this many times. So then we can say, I want you to do 4 columns of this 1FR, and then we run into this situation. We're starting to create responsive layouts with single lines of code. you were trying to do these kind of things with media queries and defining like what those percentages look like, you have to touch a lot of different elements. If you're doing it in grid, you can just say this container is going to change based on this particular idea and with these values. You're really writing one-liner code in this particular case. Neat, okay. But let's try this. So now we've got a combination of an actual specific pixel element plus 2 1FRs. So this would be a situation where, for example, if you were doing a sidebar, and you go like, my sidebar is this big, and then, you know, if you've got one of those Sony Trinitron, Maxitron kind of monitors, then whatever, let's take up as much of it as you can. And you do that situation, you wind up with this. Now this is starting to get kind of interesting because this specific idea, if you were doing this another way, you'd have to start writing like specific HTML to these things. You'd have to write containers for the sidebar to say, well, this sidebar is special. The rest of these things are contained differently. You can do really flat, straightforward HTML without a lot of container elements once you got this kind of thing. Neat, neat. We can get better. So grid template columns repeat autofill 240 pixels. So there's autofill and there's autofit. And those are situations where what we can do in this particular case is we're saying, listen, I don't know how big the browser window is, or I don't know how big the actual container element is going to end up being. But what I do know is that I want every box in that thing to be 240 pixels. Fill in as many 240 pixels, and then when you get to the end of the screen, put it on the next row. And you can do that, and you wind up with this. Now that's cool because we didn't actually define our columns, we just defined what a box was. And that's really, really interesting, except for we did create this gap because it went 240 pixels, 240 pixels, 240 pixels. All right, I'm gonna move down here. There's a lot of use cases for that specific idea, but there's other things that we can do as well. So now we're gonna get a little bit more complex. We're gonna say repeat, and I want you to auto-fill this thing, and I want you to go min-max 250 pixels, and 1FR. So now what we're saying is I want you to fill this thing up, and I'm going to give you both minimum and maximum values. And I want you to fill this thing with the values I've provided. Give that thing, you are the browser, you take that code and you try to make this thing work. So now we've wound up with this. So this is what this code ends up being. And the cool thing about that specific idea is we've actually made responsive code right now. So if we take, but we can get actually even fancier than that, okay? So I want to show you some stuff that I was really impressed with when this started to show up in the CSS spec and realized some of the things that I could do without writing JavaScript. Again, I like CSS. JavaScript is fine. It's not my favorite. There's things that we can do that used to rely on JavaScript for it. So we're going to do the same thing that we've done before. And now we're going to say, okay, so we've got our columns, and that's repeat for 1FR. We now know what that thing does. And then we're going to talk just about rum drinks. And I'm going to say, okay, so in these specific rum drinks, the mojito, the daiquiri, the pina colada, I want you to take up 2 columns and 2 rows with only those elements. Fill up this grid, but now make this thing more prioritized. And so if we do that, we actually end up with this. Now, again, we're not creating weird little container elements. We're just creating a grid where this is the first element, this is the second element, this is the third element, this is the fourth element. But because those things are defined to be bigger, they create bigger elements in that grid and fill all of that space up. Neat, neat. We can get even better. Because I'm going to show you, again, what we've been working with this entire time. So this is a flat thing of HTML without container elements. And what we're saying here is that we've got our figure, and we've got our drinks inside of them. And in all of those drinks, we're going to define what the actual glass it is that holds. So there's a tulip glass, there's a Collins glass, martini glass, blah, 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 blah. And so we're going to go and look in those glasses, and then we're going to say, well, can you actually just make some more sense out of this? Can you actually take this and put this in a cognitive set? Yeah, you actually can. So what we can do here is we can say, okay, I'm going to take this HTML and I'm going to give it this CSS. Oh wait, that's that. But I'm going to take this thing and I'm going to say, okay, my Collins glass, I want that to be ordered first. My martini glass ordered second, my tulip glass ordered third, my margarita glass order fourth. With those lines of CSS, we can actually just do this. Now, no matter where those things actually lie in the DOM, those are now ordered to the place that I put them in the CSS grid. So these elements aren't stacked like this in the HTML, but I can move those orders around. This is something you would have to do a bunch of stuff to do. This is something that, for example, newspapers run into constantly because they'll have a situation where, for example, you'd have an ad, and that ad is supposed to appear this place in the desktop, but also it's supposed to appear this place if it's on the phone, maybe it's this place if it's on a tablet, and so they'll create these JavaScript things that'll remove this thing from the DOM and shuffle your DOM around. That's annoying to write, and it's also expensive on the browser and creates a whole bunch of like flashes of content. What we're doing instead is we're taking these elements and we're saying in the CSS, just go ahead and reorder those things. Very, very, very cool, very, very interesting. Also, as a word of note, if you're doing this thing, if you're doing the CSS ordering, the one thing that I would recommend to you is if you do it to one, you got to do it to the rest. So if you go like order one, order two, order three, then great, it'll start to define those things, but you've now got this idea of order zero. You're going to have to work with that. So once you do an actual expressed ordering in your CSS grid, just make sure you carry it all the way through. One of the things that comes up in basically every CSS talk, or I mean just talks in general, it's like, well, does it work in IE? What about IE? Well, the thing is that the story is actually not as bad as you'd think it would be. So if we look at can I use data, and this is actually relative to Lithuania, what we've got is a whole bunch of green and then some red stuff. So these two things, the 10 and 11, are actually not too bad. IE 10 and 11 support CSS Grid ish. It supports CSS Grid to some extent. You're going to want to write some vendor prefixes. If you use Sass or something like that, you can have that create your vendor prefixes automatically. But you're going to need to write some vendor prefixes for it. And also, you're probably going to want to stay away from the really, really fancy stuff. But then you can touch your CSS Grid to IE and have that thing work out. If you're over here, then things aren't the best. And then the rest of this stuff is seemingly problematic, except for if we move that into a different scale, then we're actually seeing, first of all, just how insane this, I mean, I've been doing this for a long time. The idea that Chrome is this much is really amazing to me. Also, in this specific thing, if you're looking at iOS Safari and you're going, well, how does it actually rank in, iOS Firefox or iOS Chrome? Here's a fun fact. If you own an iPhone and you're using a browser called Chrome or Firefox, you're not. That is actually against the Apple terms of service to be using these other browsers. So if you're using a browser on a phone or an iPad and you're using something that's called some other browser, it's actually not. It's actually Safari with some of the other Chrome stuff put into that. But if we look at that, we can look at our straight green in Lithuania that we know how good that is, and then we can get that extra 2% with some prefixes. We can get there to a large extent and hit a whole bunch of browsers. The takeaways from this are we've got our 10 and 11. You can get there. You can get there. Try to test it. Obviously, test it a bunch, but you can get there. If you're in IE 9 minus, ooh, that's not great. But that is only 0.2% of the globe. And then every other browser, the problem is really going to be if it's basically, it now has to be about 2 years behind. It has to be not updated in about 2 years. And then you're going to not have support. But that doesn't really happen with these new browsers. But if we look at that thing, then we can look at this and go, well, this is actually even more green. We've got even bigger numbers here. And this is something called Flexbox. Now, Flexbox is something that got ignored when people were talking excitedly about CSS Grid, which is kind of a problem because Flexbox is also really, really cool. I want to talk briefly about Flex because when you're experimenting with Grid, you should think about this thing as well, because not only is it another way to do things and a way to do a grid that actually has better support, it's also a way to do things that you wouldn't be able to do in the CSS Grid. So going back to our Riker example, let's look at how we can do this specific thing in Flexbox. Well, it's a slightly more code, but we can basically get there. And what we're saying is we've got our Flex container, and we're saying that's a display flex. I want you to wrap it. If you don't define that, then a Flexbox is going to just assume it's one row. You throw that in there, and now it starts to do multiple rows. Justify content space between. That's one of the cool things about Flex. You can define, I'm going to create these elements, and now you're going to have space. And what I want you to do with them, you can do that in a bunch of different ways. Then we've got our Flex basis of our calc that we went through before. Then we've got Flex grow and Flex shrink. Now, this is actually where the power of Flexbox is. Because what we're saying is, that you're going to be running into a situation, browser, you're going to be running into a situation where things might be a little bit confusing and there might be an extra 10 pixels. And if that happens, I want you to not grow anything. This specific element, don't grow that, but it's okay to shrink it. And you can actually, these aren't binary values either. You can say, you can give this one a 9 and go, if you're going to shrink anything, absolutely shrink this particular piece of content. It creates some really, really fun ideas of just being able to just play with that space a little bit and not have that like weird 10 pixel edge case that so often you can have in those layouts. We do that thing, and we end up with our Riker grid, but Flex can be used instead of, but also in addition to. So here's something you couldn't do in grid or really any other CSS system, and that is, do you like Bjork? Bjork? I love Bjork. I feel like there's only so many artists in this world that are, to my mind, like pure artists that are doing art. Which, to be clear, Bjork has some albums that I find unlistenable, but boy, do I love that she still makes them. So what I want to do here is I want to just define some pictures of Bjork and give those on a screen, except for these images are sourced from wherever, and so I don't necessarily know the dimensions of these images that I'm going to throw into this grid. I'm going to take images sight unseen and say, well, figure it out, but don't create a bunch of weird stuff. So in doing that, we're going to say flex container, flex, then we've got our wrap, and then we say space between. So we say, in these elements, throw in the pictures, and then in the space that creates, put this one on the left, put this one on the right, and then create this much space in between. And we end up with this. Now, again, this is not a grid system. This is a system of rows. But even those rows are squishy, because I could be throwing in things of all sorts of description and still be able to create this particular idea without knowing what my content is going to be like inside of that. I can also squish those things together. I can have an equal amount of space on the left and right margins if I want to do that as well. Create some really interesting possibilities. Vertical centering is crazy easy with Flex. If you ever have worked with another front-end developer and you've said, yeah, well, I want that thing centered on the screen, and that developer has said, well, you can't do it. I mean, if that developer said that, that developer has probably also said other problematic things, because that is not true. Vertical centering with Flex is crazy easy. So what we're going to do with this is we're going to say, here's our Flex container, display Flex, and then I'm going to center this two different ways. I'm going to say align items to the center, that's going to give it vertical, and I'm going to say justify content to the center, and that's going to give it horizontal. In just that line of code, hey, we've centered something. We've done it. It's not hard. A lot of times when I find something that I think is useful for a talk or something that I think is interesting to talk about, I want to source material. If I find a blog post that I think is good, I want to give credit to the person that wrote this blog article. In this particular case, I'm not giving credit to this person because I don't think that this is a good blog article. And the reason why is that I read this thing and I don't read it like that. That's not what that looks like to me. What I actually see is this. Hey man, it's 2019. Here are 9 different CSS and JS libraries that you should know. How are you professing to be a front-end developer if you don't know these 9 different CSS and JS libraries? What's the difference between them? Basically nothing, but learn all 9. If you want to write CSS in JS, then I understand understand why you wanted to do that thing. And I'm not going to say that that's wrong, and I'm not going to say that it's unserious, and I'm not going to say that it's evil or bad or whatever. It's not specifically the way that I would write it, but if it's the thing that works for you, if it's the thing that makes sense to you, then I get why you want to get there. But if you're led down this path into the CSS and JS because you go, well, CSS is problematic and I don't understand what's going on, so I'm going to throw all this stuff in JavaScript because JavaScript makes sense to me, then I just want to take a moment to talk to you about the Cascade. So there's different sort of like math problems that I've seen before about how to calculate the Cascade. They've never really like made sense to me. They've never really been that elucidative about that. So here's what I put together. So this is how the Cascade works in my mind, and that is these rules in descending order. So every CSS rule is individual rules calculated in order, so the later order wins, of increasing specificity. So the more specific it is, that one wins. With IDs getting extreme priority, no matter what you did in the first two steps, if you've got an ID in there, that one's going to be the rule that wins. And it's beat by inline styles. Style equals is going to beat your ID rule. And important is the nuclear option. If you're running into a situation or you see code bases or you're forced to work inside of a code base where you're using this specific rule, then that's understandable and that thing happens, but try to put that thing into a file called shame.css. This is something I had to do in order to get this thing out. We're on a deadline, but we got to clear this thing up. So if you're looking at this specific idea, and then we've got this piece of CSS, we've got some competing rules here. I'm going to leave this up for just a sec, and I'm going to let you think of what this looks like. Were you right? Maybe? One of the things that you can do to help you out with that, if you've never tried, Firefox made a quantum engine that is really, really, really good. If you use Chrome, awesome, no problem. But if you've never tried out Firefox in the last, I'd say, year and a half, give it a shot because the inspector is really amazing. And one of the things that you can do when the Cascade is confusing to you is actually just look at these elements and say, well, okay, so this paragraph has a couple of rules, and this background green got crossed out. And you can look at that thing and tie that back to the style sheet and not only see the rule that won, but you're able to see why that rule won. When you start to look at those, the site in the inspector, the reasoning behind what happened on the screen is actually displayed inside of the developer console. That starts to make more sense. I'm short on time, so I'm going to have to blast through the very end of this here. And that is some things that you can learn, use, and I strongly, strongly recommend. First one is CSS Diner. CSS Diner is really well made, really, really fun. And essentially what you do is you've got a series of levels. And in this particular idea, we want to select all the plates and the bentos. So, okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to say plate, comma, bento. Yeah. And this is when you're trying to figure out specificity and how to write a class that actually captures those things. This is super useful. As somebody that's worked in CSS a lot, I still found this really, really useful to kind of brush up on my skills and figure out how to pick those selectors. The next one I want to give you is, it's called Flexbox Froggy. I'm not going to show you this one just because of a time limit, but Flexbox Froggy is really pretty good tool. We've got 24 different levels, and essentially what we're doing is, in every single level, we're trying to put the frogs on top of their lily pads. The moment you write the right piece of code, it's going to correct that for you, and you'll win the level. Useful. Also, by the very same guy, is something called Grid Garden. It's essentially Flexbox Froggy, but for the grid system. You go through these 24 levels, and all you're trying to do is just water your plants, and you're doing that with the grid system. It gives you instant feedback about how this thing works. If you're on the other side of the CSS debate, I'm going to skip that one. If you're on the other side of the CSS debate, this site is insane. It's called CSS Battle, and the idea is that you're trying to match a image specifically using as little code as possible, which means that you get to write really, really terrible HTML and really, really awful unsemantic CSS because you're trying to get as few characters as possible. I'm kind of addicted to it. So I hope that by the end of this talk that we started out here. And I'm hoping that by the end of this talk, some of the things that I've said have made you realize that CSS is useful, and it's cool, and it's surprising, and it's really elegant. And I want you to take some of these things that you've learned and try to play around with this language that I love so much. Thank you so much. My name's Lemon.